All right, welcome to Criminalistics and Forensic Science. This is the first of what will be about 20 lessons over the next 6 weeks, where we talk about all the different aspects that make up forensic science, or the study of crime and criminals. We're going to start with just a brief history of what forensic science is. We're going to define some terms, talk about some different people, and at the conclusion of this week's 3 lessons, make sure that you then go through and finish the study guide and turn that in. All of the answers to the questions are found in one of the lessons here, either this one or lesson 2 or lesson 3. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. All right, so what is forensic science? Forensic science is the study and application of science and how it applies to law. The word criminalistics means the same as forensic science. I put the title of this class as Criminalistics and Forensic Science so people didn't confuse it with forensics, which is the idea of debate and persuasive speaking, which is a big thing here at Berkeley. I wanted to make sure that we distinguish the two. So you could have called this class Criminalistics or Forensic Science. I called it both just to make sure we were all on the same page. Forensic science is defined as the use of science and technology to enforce civil and criminal laws. So somebody doesn't have to commit a violent crime like a murder. That would be a criminal law in order to use forensic science. Civil laws are also use a degree of forensics. Things like traffic code violations. You can use physics to angulate different speeds. You can use paternity tests to determine fathers' parental rights. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a criminal to use forensic science. It's very vague and hard to define because it includes so many other areas of science. So you can't say that forensic science is a branch of biology or a branch of science or physics or chemistry, because it really is one of the few sciences that incorporates all of them. I just mentioned the difference between civil and criminal law, so let's make sure we're all on the same page there. Civil law, a civil case is filed by a private party. That could be a corporation or an individual or person. So the things that you see like on Judge Joe Brown or Judge Judy or the People's Court, all of that, those are all civil cases where I sue you. The government itself is not involved there. A penalty in a civil case is a loss, some kind of a monetary loss. Either they have to give up the car or they have to pay a fine. But there's no incarceration. Nobody goes to jail in a civil suit unless you misbehave in court and you're found in contempt and you go to jail for a couple of days to think about it. But the end result of a civil case is never incarceration. Criminal law, on the other hand, is where the government itself is suing a person. That's why you hear the people versus blah, because it's a government thing. The penalty for a guilty person could be incarceration. That means going to jail or prison. There is a difference between jail and prison. A fine paid directly to the government, or in some extreme cases, death and execution. Those are known as capital crimes. Crimes in this category are divided into 2 classes. Misdemeanors are crimes that are punishable by less than a year in jail or prison, and then there's a felony, in which case the sentence would carry more than a year. Here's the first kind of depiction of what forensic science is. This kind of comes to where the word comes. I'm a big fan of learning where words come. And forensic science, the word forensis, comes from the Latin word forum. So that's what that picture was. It was a picture of the Roman forum. So during the time of the Romans, a criminal charge meant presenting the case before the public. Both the person accused of the crime and the accuser would give speeches based on their side of the story. And the neat thing is that the person who had the best argument would win the case. It really didn't have anything to do with the law or evidence. It was really just who argued their case better. And a big part of that is still present in our judicial system today, but they didn't have the branch of science that was forensics, so they couldn't introduce evidence. They simply just argued their case. So our system of government, our method of trying people for crimes and putting them in jail has a little bit of that argumentatory component to it, but it also has to do with evidence. One of the people that you have to talk about when you're talking about where forensic science came from is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was one of the very first science fiction authors in the late 1800s. His creation was Sherlock Holmes, and there have been many incarnations of Sherlock Holmes. He was a crime solver who used science. And the reason, now I said science fiction because this wasn't done back in that day. Somebody looked guilty, somebody said, oh yeah, that person stole my stuff, you were guilty in a court of law. He believed in the idea of deductive reasoning, using small facts to then make a bigger argument. Now, just to kind of show you how far ahead of his time he was, in a book that he wrote in 1887, the first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet. Popular note to self: it is a popular myth that The Hound of the Baskervilles was the first Sherlock Holmes novel. That is not true. The first Sherlock Holmes novel was A Study in Scarlet. That was published in 1887. And I have it here, and I just want to read just a quick passage. Right? Are we ready? Here we go. I found it! I found it! He shouted to my companion, running towards us with a test tube in his hand. I have found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and nothing else. Why, man, it is the most practical medico-legal discovery in years. Don't you see that this gives us an infallible test for blood stains? The old Guiacum test was very clumsy and uncertain, so is the microscopic examination for blood corpuscles. The latter is valueless if the stains are a few hours old. Now it appears to act as well whether the stain is old or new. Had this test been invented, there had been hundreds of men now walking the earth who would have long ago paid the penalty of their crimes. In this speech, Sherlock Holmes comes up with a presumptive blood test. A blood test that actually shows the presence of hemoglobin in both a new and an old sample. We have one of those now. It's called the Kastle-Meyer test, and it wasn't invented for another 50 years. So kind of like a lot of the stuff that we saw that was fiction on Star Trek is now true, a lot of the stuff that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about in his crime detective novels is actually true now in forensic science, which is actually pretty cool. All right, but now for the real guys. All right, so a couple of people we need to know. You will need to, now, again, I'm not really interested in dates. I just want to know the basics. So if you could match these people to what they were most responsible for, that would be great. So Matthieu Orfila was the father of toxicology, first guy to write a book about detections of poisons and their effect on animals. Sort of gross and a little mean. I mean, he obviously tested poisons on animals and see what happened, but without this book, we wouldn't know what to look for different poisons. Classic example, and we're going to get to this a little bit later in the class, is arsenic, which turns your nail beds blue. Alphonse Bertillon, is the father of anthropometry, which is also now known as biometrics. Now, we don't use this system anymore, but this, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, this was the precursor to fingerprints. The idea was, how can we distinguish scientifically one person from another? I mean, obviously, everybody looks slightly different, but how do we actually scientifically say, you are a different person than this person? That's actually a harder question to ask than you'd think, or to answer, rather. So what he did was he created this system of 19 different measurements of the body, both sitting down and standing up. And with these measurements, he said that you could actually determine one person from another. Now, this is a great system, and it kind of works. But to do this, you'd actually have to have a person who could sit down and stand up in all these positions. That's really hard to do with someone who's dead, and even harder to do if somebody is missing a limb, and impossible to do unless you have the person. So fingerprints are better because fingerprints are left at a scene, whereas you can't leave your body behind to be measured. So Francis Galton then moved on as the father of fingerprinting. Using Bertillon's system, he then decided to go further and talk about fingerprinting as a way to uniquely identify individuals. We're going to talk a little bit about fingerprinting in lesson 3. Fingerprints have always been used for a system of identification in documents and merchant bills as far back as the ancient Chinese. But he was the first guy to suggest that they could be used to determine guilt in a crime. This is his basic patterning. We're going to talk a lot about this too, the idea of the loops, the whorls, and the arches. Leon Latz is the father of bloodstain identification. He was the first guy to come up with the ABO blood typing system, which is, again, something we're going to talk a lot about a little bit later. Calvin Goddard is the father of ballistics. He was the one who developed a unique technique to develop. He was the one who developed the technique to examine bullets using what's called a comparison microscope, and you can kind of see it up here. It was actually one microscope with two different objective barrels, but when you looked in through the top, you could see what was in here on the right and what was in here on the left. And by putting two bullets down on each side, you could actually look at the striations and show that the striations are identical. All right, so here's some examples of different bullets. We're going to talk about this when we get to ballistics and trace evidence. Albert Osborne is considered the father of document examination. His work led to the acceptance of documents as scientific evidence by the courts. He did a lot of work with the brand new, at this time, electron microscope to show that how checks can be counterfeited by looking at how different ink stains were raised on an electron micrograph. Very neat stuff here. Walter McCrone is the father of microscopic forensics. Again, he developed and applied his microscope techniques to examine evidence in countless court cases. So he was the one who first determined that human hairs look different than animal hairs, that human blood cells look different than animal blood cells, and came up with a system of classifying them so that not only could we tell that there were differences, we could also prove that two hairs were identical as well. Hans Gross was the father of forensic publications. He wrote the book on applying all of the different science disciplines to the field of criminal investigations. In other words, he was the guy who wrote the first textbook of forensic science. Edmund Lockhart. This one you've got to put a big star on, because Lockhart is one of the biggest names in forensic science. Considered the father of the crime lab. In 1910, he started the first crime lab in an attic of a police station, actually in Los Angeles. And with a few tools, he became known as the first forensic scientist and criminal investigator. He actually started the Institute of Criminalistics in France. His most important contribution was the Locard exchange principle. And what this says is that every contact leaves a trace. He believed that every criminal could be connected to a crime by particles carried from the crime scene. So in other words, if you walk on a carpet, a few carpet fibers stay with you. If you walk past a cat, a few hairs are going to transfer to you. If you lean over a body long enough, some of your hair and skin cells will fall on them. If somebody slaps you or scratches you, your hair, your skin is going to be under their nails. And using this principle, this is actually how we catch quite a few criminals. Fingerprints on bodies, which you can pull off. And then there's J. Edgar Hoover, the father of the FBI, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation during the 30s. He was actually the director of the FBI for 48 years, over 8 different presidents. He covered Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, and the Korean, Cold, and Vietnam Wars. He organized the first national laboratory to offer forensic services to all law enforcement agencies. Until this point, each individual police station was in charge of their own scientific investigations, and you could imagine big cities had money, little cities didn't. The FBI offers their services to anyone who doesn't have their own local crime lab. When we talk about forensics, one of the things we should mention is this one. All right, that picture is of Orenthal James Simpson, also known as O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was a fantastic running back in his college days and actually went on to a very successful professional career and then a very successful career as an actor. Right? But that's not how people remember him now. Believe it or not, when I was in middle school and the beginning of my high school career, O.J. Simpson was one of the most popular actors around because he was a star in one of the most popular film franchises of the time called The Naked Gun. And there were 3 Naked Gun movies, and they were box office smashes, and everybody who was everybody had seen the Naked Gun movies. And he was known as Nordberg. And Nordberg was hysterical. He was always getting beat up in the movies, and it was actually a lot of fun. But that's not how anybody remembers him now. Because when I was in high school, O.J. Simpson was put on trial for murdering his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman in 1994. Now, he was acquitted of all charges. Interestingly enough, O.J. Simpson is currently in jail at the moment in Nevada, serving a very long sentence for attempted murder of somebody else and grand theft. But it was the trial. The trial became known as the trial of the century, and to my knowledge, no other trial has come close. It went on for days. It went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was the first time that the public came in contact with real forensic science evidence. Forensic science evidence had been in place in court cases for years. But this was the first time that a nationally publicized trial depended heavily on things like DNA analysis, RFLP analysis, and most people in the country had no idea what they were talking about, including the jury. So we were not educated enough to understand the data that was presented. Now, the data as it was presented was pretty solid. But the prosecutors did not do very well explaining it. So forensic science has two parts. First, to do the science, honestly and reproducibly. But then the second part is to be able to communicate that to people who do not have a science degree. So what officially went wrong? The first people on the scene were the police, and they found evidence of blood. And they entered the Simpson home without a search warrant. All right. Now, that causes a lot of problems in the judicial system, especially when you're collecting evidence. But when there were huge amounts of blood outside. It wasn't like, oh, somebody here had a cut. Pools of blood outside. So the police called it an emergency, and they went into the house. However, the police collected a pair of blood-stained gloves during the search. You can enter a house without a search warrant, but you can't take anything out of the house, and you shouldn't even really touch anything without then calling the judge and getting a search warrant. They did not do that. They removed evidence from the scene of the crime without securing it first, and that put that particular evidence into a huge light of mistrust. The idea being, how do we know they actually came from the house? You didn't wait for the forensics crime scene to properly process the scene. We don't know where they came from. We don't even know if they were his. Collection of evidence without a proper warrant then became the key argument used by Simpson's legal team and ultimately really led to his acquittal. It did not help matters that one of the first officers on the scene was a known and documented racist and had made some very, very, very improper statements in public and in his email, and cast a huge shadow of doubt over the evidence. This is O.J. Simpson trying on the gloves that were evidenced. He claimed that the gloves were too small and therefore could not possibly have been his. And since, again, the scene wasn't processed properly, there was no way to prove that they were. Looked like they fit to me, but they were very small on his hands, and which would happen if they were if leather gloves were soaked in a liquid over time, and then they would dry. So the whole point of the trial of the century, the only point in bringing it up, is that if forensic evidence is to be admissible, then the highest professional standards of collecting evidence must be used at the crime scene. That is the lesson that the world learned, that even though the evidence that was taken, processed in the lab, was absolutely rock solid. I mean, the blood on the gloves matched OJ. It matched the victims. I mean, perfectly. Everything that was done in the forensics lab was fantastic. But at the crime scene, proper evidence handling procedures were not followed, and the jury had a lot of doubts, and rightfully so. We don't know where those gloves came from. We don't know if the officers who were first at the scene took those gloves and rolled them around in the blood outside before they took them out, because they didn't follow proper procedure. All right, so that's the end of lesson 1. Go ahead and answer any questions on your study guide that have to do with lesson 1, and then I will see you for lesson 2.